Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 18th Annual Conference on American Studies Founding Principles and History with the Center for American Studies here at Christopher Newport. My name's Elizabeth Coffer-Bush, and I'm co-director of the Center. For those of you who don't know anything about the Center, let me say a few things about it. We were founded nearly 20 years ago to help bolster attention to our American Studies, Constitutional Studies major and minor, and also our National Security Studies minor. We provide paid internships annually, so if any of you are interested, we will be posting that most likely next week. Our mission is to reinvigorate the study of civics, both at the K-12 and university levels, and to promote teaching and scholarship on those principles. So I'm going to hand things over to my esteemed colleague and friend, Dr. Jonathan White, who many of you know, and he is one of our nation's top Lincoln and now Frederick Douglass scholars as well. So please join me welcoming.
Well, thanks, Liz. It's good to see all of you here today, so many from my class. Don't forget, anything Dr. Morel says is fair game for the midterm exam, so pay good attention. It's a pleasure for me to introduce my friend Lucas Morel. Lucas is the John K. Boardman Jr. Professor of Politics at Washington and Lee University, where he also chairs the politics department, and he's taught there since 1999. He's the author or editor of 5 books, including Lincoln's Sacred Effort, Defining Religion's Role in American Self-Government, Lincoln and Liberty, Wisdom for the Ages, and most recently, Lincoln and the American Founding. Lucas is a trustee of the Supreme Court Historical Society, a former president of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, and a commissioner on the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission, I said that right, I think, which is planning celebrations to commemorate America's 250th birthday. I've known Lucas, I think, for about 20 years, give or take now, and I think this is his 3rd or 4th time speaking here at CNU. He and I are in daily contact with emails, texts, and phone calls right now because we're collaborating on a documentary edition of everything Frederick Douglass ever wrote or said about Abraham Lincoln. And he'll be talking to us today about Frederick Douglass, the Constitution, and free speech. So please join me in welcoming Lucas Morel.
Thanks, John. Thank you, Professor White and Professor Bush, wherever you went. I guess if I've been here 3 times, we're going to try to get it right this time. Something wrong here? Maybe raise this up a little. Wow, it's not even picking. I can hear myself. Oh, that's a lot different. This won't stay up though. That work? How's that? Close enough. Fair enough. Fair enough. Frederick Douglass, according to one book, he was the most photographed man in America in the 19th century. His fame owed to the fact not only that he escaped from slavery, but also because he went on to become one of the most famous orators during America's greatest trial, the Civil War. At a time when bullets prevailed over ballots, he kept the faith that ultimately words in this country, in a self-governing regime, had to prevail over violence. Who better to teach us about civil discourse and civil disobedience than a man whose very life depended on both civil discourse and civil disobedience? He had to disobey the law to find his freedom, and then he spoke as a law-abiding citizen on behalf of freedom. So my talk will focus on Douglass as a master of what we're calling civil discourse. I like the word civil because it has at least 2 important meanings. First, to be civil is to be polite. It's to be courteous. We'll see that when it comes to free speech, being polite or civil to one another helps speech fulfill its purpose. Second definition, actually I think the primary one, if you look to the Latin, has to do with the city or the concerns of citizens. Civil discourse, in other words, is a way of saying free speech. It's a conversation between citizens. In its highest form, I think it's a form of civic education. If Frederick Douglass spent his life doing anything, It was this: civic education. I know when we think of Douglass, we think of abolition. We think of civil rights of Black Americans in particular, especially the right to vote, the elimination of racial prejudice from all laws and social practices. But these, I would say, are the product of civil or civic education, the objects for which right-minded Americans speak in order to enact or carry out the principles of freedom. Both definitions, speech that is courteous and civic, can help us see why Frederick Douglass spoke not only of the rights of the speaker, but of the rights of the hearer. So I want to underline that, the rights of the hearer. A month after Lincoln's 1860 election to the presidency, a meeting of Boston abolitionists was mobbed, Boston, for daring to discuss, of all things, how to get rid of slavery. Douglass commented on the violence that disrupted that public assembly. To suppress free speech, he explained, is a double wrong. It violates the rights of the hearer as well as those of the speaker. Below the Mason-Dixon line, slave states employed despotic, tyrannical measures to silence opposition. Douglass said slavery cannot tolerate free speech. He said that in describing a free mind, it is the dread of tyrants. The right of free speech, quote, is the right which they first of all strike down. In addition to mobbing abolition speakers, they censored the mail of abolition publications, and of course they prohibited slaves from even learning how to read. Douglass was all the more shocked that this mob prevented the right of the people to assemble and to express their opinion in Boston, the cradle of the American Revolution. Now, we're more accustomed to speaking of the right of free speech, the right of the speaker, but Douglass insisted, as I've mentioned, that the right to speak was meaningless without remembering and therefore protecting the right to hear. In doing so, he was reminding us of the purpose of free speech, which is to persuade. Free speech, the use of and appeal to reason, exists for the sake of truth. When we forget the hearer, which is to say, the audience, the right of the hearer, we forget the point of speech. We end up simply insisting on our right to speak, regardless of whether it promotes understanding or knowledge, leading to some common good. That's the civil or civic component. So to engage in civil discourse means we should have respect for one another, even before we start talking. We owe that to each other simply because we are fellow citizens. We're members of something bigger than ourselves, the same political community. And so this requires a kind of restraint or self-control when we speak to each other. To listen is to exercise restraint simply by waiting our turn to speak. Because in America, where the central idea is all men are created equal, we have to take turns. No one should have any more rights or privileges than anyone else. Sure, each of us thinks we're right, wants to have our way be the way for everyone else. But in a system where you govern only according to the consent of the governed, you must persuade others to do things your way. Decent citizens should speak and therefore listen in turn. Only tyrants insist on getting their way without hearing or heeding what others have to say. So by reminding us of the hearer, Douglass reminds us of the purpose of free speech, why we want to protect it, and why, therefore, diversity of speech, diversity of thought is so important. That's because, as I mentioned earlier, the purpose of speech is to persuade. It is an appeal to reason. Douglas is teaching us that free speech, in its highest sense, seeks an audience. It's not an end in itself, but a means to an end. Ultimately, it is a means of education, civic education, that a free people cannot do without. Now, we think of civic education as lessons taught in school, or at least lessons that should be taught. Lessons about, say, the first principles of a free society. In the American case, that would be, of course, the Declaration of Independence, structures of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and I would include the triumphs and travails of America's history-long struggle to align its practices with its noblest ideals, all to the good. But civic education, I believe, actually begins at home. Now, of all the harms Douglas attributed to slavery, he thought that the denial of an education was the worst of slavery's ills. It would forever unfit him to be a slave, Douglas recalled his legal master saying when he discovered that Douglas was being taught his letters, how to spell. From that moment, Douglas said, I understood the pathway to freedom. He believed education, the cultivation of reason and character fit for a truly free life, was essential to the improvement of any human being. For Douglas, of course, this meant a cultivation of reading, writing, and speaking, and set Douglas's course for liberation even before he escaped from slavery. He eventually escaped, fleeing to New Bedford, Massachusetts, eventually came under the tutelage of William Lloyd Garrison, editor of The Liberator, and in my opinion, the most famous abolitionist in America. In 1845, Douglas published a book many of you perhaps have read, a narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. But soon after, we're talking 2 or 3 months after it was published, Douglass had to flee the United States because he explained in his book where he had lived as a slave and how he got away. He gave details. That's right, his words got him into trouble. Freedom of speech was not yet freedom for Douglass because under the laws of Maryland and the federal government, he was liable to capture as a fugitive slave. So for almost 2 years, Douglass spoke on the abolition circuit in England, Ireland, and Scotland. He was only able to return to the United States after friends of his in Great Britain and America purchased his legal manumission. He was now no longer an outlaw on American soil, but a free man, could now receive the protection of the laws. And although British friends implored him to stay in England, send for his family so that he could live out his days in freedom and ease in England, Douglass chose to return home, quote, for the sake of my brethren. As he put it, to lift up my voice in their behalf, to speak and write in their vindication, struggle in their ranks for that emancipation which shall yet be achieved by the power of truth and of principle for that oppressed people. Free speech, in other words, became Frederick Douglass's vocation as an orator and writer, and his words would help shape public opinion in America for almost the next 50 years. When he returned in 1847 to the States, Douglass joined the ranks of newspaper editors by founding an abolition newspaper himself, the North Star, in December of 1847. He then spoke and wrote almost daily for the sake of emancipating slaves, and most importantly, to rid the country of racial prejudice, the very thing that he thought undergirded not only slavery, but all discriminatory laws in America. Now, a leading activist for women's rights, and Douglass was an early adopter when it came to women's rights, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, She recalled watching Douglass give a speech. He stood there like an African prince, majestic in his wrath, as with wit, satire, and indignation. He graphically described the bitterness of slavery, the humiliation of subjection to those who in all human virtues and powers were inferior to himself. His ferocity of spirit was matched by a fierce intelligence that produced not only his renowned narrative, the first of 3 autobiographies, but also speeches and editorials that stand, in my opinion, as lasting contributions to the progress of liberty in America. That intelligence led a man who had every reason to hate America to become one of this country's greatest defenders. Douglass made a career of reminding Americans of the ideals of the Declaration of Independence and the protections of a constitution he initially read as pro-slavery. But by July of 1851, he was persuaded by political abolitionists like Lysander Spooner, William Goodell, and Gerrit Smith that a constitution that made no mention of slavery, the word never appears until the 13th Amendment is ratified, a preamble that spoke of justice and the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. He came to think that that Constitution should be interpreted by what he considered to be a plain reading of the text without trying to discover any sort of hidden or unwritten intentions of its framers. He also noted that the Constitution permitted Congress to ban the importation of slaves in 20 years, which it did, January 1, 1808, as soon as it could under the Constitution. Douglass concluded, therefore, that it leans to freedom, not slavery, and looked to the abolition of slavery rather than to its perpetuity. Douglass departed, therefore, from abolitionists like his mentor, William Lloyd Garrison, in claiming the Constitution for abolitionists who sought a political solution to the problem of slavery, not only in the federal territories where the battle raged in that pivotal decade before the Civil War, but also, according to Douglass, in the states where it already existed. There were times, yes, when Douglass preached a dissolution of the Union if free states continued to aid and abet slaveholding. But he almost always maintained that the best prospects for emancipation would occur within, not outside the constitutional union. Dissolution, as Garrison counseled, might strike a blow for moral purity. No union with slaveholders was on the masthead of the Liberator. But it would doom, according to Douglass, the enslaved to their unjust and degraded status. It would not relieve citizens of the free states of their responsibility for undoing the harm that he believed they committed by extending slavery's lease on life through the original union with the American slaveholding states. After Civil War broke out, Douglass argued that it should become immediately an abolition war. When most loyal Americans at that time, including President Lincoln, insisted that preserving the Union was the only legitimate objective under the Constitution. But the friction of war eventually led the president to emancipate slaves in rebel territories or states as a means of preserving union. A few weeks after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he gave a lecture, Douglass did, and he titled it Popular Error and Unpopular Truth. He said, there's no such thing as new truth. Error might be old or new, but truth, old as the universe. The truth that all human beings possessed natural rights led Douglass to say of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation that a fatal blow had at last been struck at the root of the gigantic evil. The president's proclamation had given the slaves the legal right to liberty. Now they could obtain their personal freedom without trampling civil laws. So Douglass saw the Emancipation Proclamation not as giving, but as restoring to the enslaved their natural rights, rights that human laws should have been protecting all along. This was an important observation, born of America's own origin as a nation founded upon timeless truths. The idea of universal, natural rights was what Douglass considered an unpopular truth. Unpopular because until 1776, there wasn't a country in the earth that believed what Americans held to be self-evidently true. So Douglass noted that by emancipating slaves, quote, Mr. Lincoln has dared to apply the old truth of human liberty to this time. He has dared to declare the truth of the Declaration of Independence. With Lincoln and the American founders, Douglass believed human equality was one of those truths as old as the universe. Under the friction of civil war, that truth began to be secured for all Black Americans. But I speak of war. Douglass spoke of war, but he also said and thought that it was chiefly a contest of words, not a battle of arms, to which one could attribute emancipation. This is Douglass. Though wrung out by the stern dictates of military necessity, it was in reality a moral necessity. Without what he called a principle in man which induces him to accept truth, Douglass held little hope for progress in human affairs. For him, speech, an appeal to right and not might, held the key to the march of liberty in America. He pointed out that it was slavery that required violations of free speech. He was confident, however, that, quote, truth must triumph under a system of free discussion. He even quoted a slaveholder named Thomas Jefferson. Error might be left free so long as truth was free to combat it. He added, equally true, though not always equally manifest, error can never be safely tolerated when truth is not left free to combat it. In February, following the Emancipation Proclamation, Douglass gave a major speech at Cooper Institute in New York City. It was titled The Proclamation and a Negro Army. While he praised Lincoln's proclamation as the greatest event of our nation's history, he actually spoke at length about the connection between freedom for the enslaved and freedom of speech. Such is my confidence in the potency of truth, Douglass declared, in the power of reason, that had the right of free discussion been preserved during the last 30 years, we should now have no slavery to breed rebellion, nor war to drench our land with blood. He insisted slavery would have fallen, as it has fallen, when men can assail it with the weapons of reason and the facts of experience. He went on to poke fun at slaveholders who claim that discussion has convinced them that slavery is right. Douglass pointed out, yeah, discussion which only permits one side to be heard compels the other to remain silent. Yeah, that would be, as he put it, likely to produce just such a result. In the South, one only hears from the slaveholder, but not the slave. And so he thought it was no coincidence that on the side of the oppressor is power, while the slave is kept in weakness. The last thing slaveholders desired was a fair fight. And for Douglass, this was not a matter of might per se, but which side could appeal to right. December of that year, the year of Jubilee, with military emancipation by presidential decree in full swing, Douglass gave another speech entitled, Our Work is not done. Looking past the war's end and the abolition of slavery, he predicted greater resistance to the elevation of the freedmen and freedwomen than to their emancipation. There was no question that they would, in his mind, need the protection of the federal government. But key to that protection, most important of all, was the right to vote. To those who argued that to grant the franchise, the vote to Black Americans was to bring brutality and ignorance into the ballot box, Douglass pointed out their hypocrisy, for they did not bar whites from voting who exhibited those characteristics. He said, in saying this, you lay down a rule for the black man that you apply to no other class of your citizens. And then he made it personal. Away with this talk of the lack of knowledge on the part of the Negro. I'm about as big a Negro as you will ever find anywhere. Any man that does not believe I know enough to vote, let him try it. I think I can convince him that I do. And then he proposed a test. Let him run for office in my district, solicit my vote, and I will show him. By playfully shifting from the strength of his body to the power of his mind, Douglass invited any honest white man to treat him as an equal citizen of his community and therefore worthy of an appeal to his mind in order to get elected. What was this but an exercise of free speech that appealed to free speech? A reminder that government by consent is a two-way street involving the freedom to think, argue on the part of both the rulers and the ruled. Freedom of speech in this context is nothing more than an appeal to the consent of the governed as the only legitimate ruler of a free people. To speak in the public square is to argue, to make claims about justice, what government could rightly command citizens to do. It is an appeal to each other's reason, in hopes that informed opinions rather than inflamed passions or righteous indignation will direct public policy towards the common good. Now, this requires a public space that protects the expression of different opinions, which means some of them, believe it or not, are going to be wrong. But it's only by this free exchange of viewpoints that the public will be equipped to tell the difference and choose wisely. It was that free exchange of views, what I call intellectual diversity, that led Douglass to rethink his connection to America and its founding principles and political structures. Early in his career as an abolition speaker, Douglass said, I have no love for America. I have no patriotism. I have no country. What country have I? The institutions of this country do not know me. They do not recognize me as a man. What were those institutions? The church, government, the Constitution. Given that America's slavery could not exist without the cooperation of northern free states with the southern slaveholding states, Douglass declared of the federal government, I desire to see its overthrow as speedily as possible. Constitution shivered in 1,000 fragments. At this point in his speaking career, Douglass was used to being heckled with racial epithets, pelted with rotten eggs, and navigating his way through anti-abolition mobs. And again, this is in New England. His condemnation of the American government and Constitution made him few friends among those not already in the abolition camp. Abolition at that time, especially of this strain, these Garrisonian abolitionists, they were considered a fringe element in society. 1830s and 40s, you didn't invite these guys to your parties. Until 1849, Frederick Douglass, in a word, could not love a country that did not love him. To his credit, and I believe America's, he did not hold that position for long. He eventually came to believe in America as his country, called the principles of the Declaration of Independence saving principles, and then interpreted the Constitution as what he called a glorious liberty document. In a public career that spanned half a century, Douglass joined a vanguard of blacks and whites in the struggle to align this nation's practices with its noblest professions. With this conviction, Douglass devoted himself to getting white Americans, quote, to trust the operation of their own principles, end quote. In this, he foreshadowed Justice Lewis Harlan's famous lone dissent in the infamous 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson case, the case that produced the insidious doctrine of separate but equal. Justice Harlan in 1896 wrote, "Our Constitution is colorblind, neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law." It's 1896, Justice Harlan. Listen to Douglass 30 years earlier. Douglass observed simply that the Constitution, quote, knows no distinction between citizens on account of color, end quote. After the Civil War, Douglass stated that his goal was to make our government entirely consistent with itself. So he concluded, quote, that the burden of our demand upon the American people shall be justice and fair play. We utterly repudiate all invidious distinctions, whether in our favor or against us. We only ask for a fair field and no favor. He found those principles inherent in the American founding. As President Bill Clinton once said, probably the best thing he ever said, first inaugural address, he said, "Our democracy must be not only the envy of the world, but the engine of our own renewal. There is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America." What Douglass learned from the writings of Washington, Jefferson, and Madison was that the only relevant minority in America was the minority of one, the individual. In Douglass's words, color should not be a criterion of rights. He recognized that the protection of the rights of a specific group, whites, was harming the rights of another group, blacks. So he concluded, "I know of no rights of race superior to the rights of humanity." He was a rock-ribbed believer in the equal protection of the law, equality under the law. He did not believe that race should be the measure of anyone's constitutional rights. He believed an emphasis upon race, in fact, was a losing proposition for blacks in America. Instead of equal protection, Douglass declared, "You lay down a rule for the black man that you apply to no other class of your citizens." And so when he was asked the misbegotten, stupid question, "What shall be done with the Negro when freed?" Hated that question, got it all the time. He said 3 words, "Let us alone." "Do nothing with us," he continued, "for us or by us as a particular class. I affirm that the broadest and bitterest of the black man's misfortunes is the fact that he is everywhere regarded and treated as an exception to the principles and maxims which apply to other men." Douglass believed that as long as blacks were seen and treated as exceptions, color prejudice would continue, and they would never be accepted as full members of the American polity. Now, did Douglass really mean that black Americans should be let alone? Do nothing? Really? He explained, "All I ask is, give him a chance to stand on his own legs. If you see him on his way to school, let him alone. Don't disturb him. You see him going to the dinner table at a hotel? Let him go. You see him going to the ballot box. Let him alone. Don't disturb him. If you see him going into a workshop, just let him alone. Your interference is doing him a positive injury." So, blacks pursuing an education, a meal in a public venue, the vote, a job. Does the government owe a black person, anything when it comes to these vital pursuits? It was 1865 when Douglass made these statements. His audience knew the context for his examples. Blacks, in fact, were not given a chance to stand on their own legs. They were harassed, persecuted, and killed in their attempts to learn, to eat, to vote, and to learn a trade. To be left alone, as Douglass insisted, did not mean to be left at the mercy of a racist mob. It meant to be, in fact, protected by government, no more and no less, like every other American citizen. This is how he understood equality under law, which is why the vote was so important to Douglass. To be freed from an individual legal master, but not allowed to vote, was simply to be the slave of the community, as he put it. Douglass said, where universal suffrage is the rule, where that is the fundamental idea of the government, to rule us out is to make us an exception, to brand us with the stigma of inferiority, and it is to invite to our heads the missiles of those about us. Douglass gave many reasons why blacks should have the right to vote. But I believe this concern for public opinion, what a ban against black voting taught white people regarding the humanity of blacks and therefore what they were owed as citizens by the government, was a long-standing priority of Douglass. But he insisted that the vote be granted to blacks not because they were black, but because they were citizens. The government of all should be partial to none. Anything that made blacks a special case in the public eye would undermine their equality as American citizens and as human beings. This actually reinforced white supremacy, at least that mindset. He didn't see how that mindset, the myth of white supremacy, could be dispelled if blacks were exempted from the rules that applied to everyone else. Color prejudice, in his mind, was the great enemy of black progress in the United States. And so most of his efforts on behalf of civil and political rights were directed towards promoting policies that eliminated government distinctions based upon race. Instead of living as an exception to the rules that applied to others, he thought blacks should integrate with the majority white population as much as possible. They should endeavor, quote, to make themselves and be made by others a part of the American people in every sense of the word. He thought whites needed to recognize that their destiny was tied up with the destiny of blacks. And so he encouraged blacks, for example, to avoid self-segregation. Instead, he said, quote, we should distribute ourselves among the people, build our houses where if they take fire, other houses will be in danger. Common dangers will create common safeguards. So here he speaks of the threat of physical danger, providing an incentive for common protection. But for Douglass, as important as physical protection is political protection, especially for the right to speak. And I think venues for the expression of diverse opinions are now as important as ever. I'm going to bring us to the present here. Douglass, I think, would be shocked to find that in the 21st century, American universities, including law schools fairly recently, have disinvited speakers, given in to what was known as the heckler's veto. Instead of acting as truth-seeking institutions, providing a safe space for what? For robust debate and civil discussion in the pursuit of knowledge, colleges, in my opinion, have failed to protect visiting speakers from verbal harassment, even physical intimidation. So far, so good. Why prevent free discussion? That Douglass argued was essential to the triumph of truth, what he called the rights of the hearer, as well as those of the speaker. For any American university worth its mission statement, keeping the rights of the hearer front and center should be the first order of business. This means a university should help students think through their opinions Guided by their professors, students should read, discuss academic subjects in conversation with fellow students. For this conversation to be productive, it has to be free. It must be modeled and it must be protected. In the words of Douglas, there can be no right of speech where any man is overawed by force and compelled to suppress his honest sentiments. You should use that in your copy. I believe this requires the utmost commitment to freedom of speech, which is in the end a commitment to freedom of thought. It is the highest respect colleges can pay their students. Why? Because it appeals to the highest element of their souls, their reason. Surveys have shown that college students feel like they can't speak freely, share their opinions for fear of being, chorus, canceled. Douglas said, liberty is meaningless where the right to utter one's thoughts and opinions has ceased to exist. Liberty cannot be preserved by a people fed a steady diet of righteous indignation and moral outrage. Deliberation, not emotions, must prevail. Otherwise, not right but might will carry the day. This will not express the deliberative will of the community, but simply the will of the stronger, which is the exact opposite of why civil society exists. In preparing my remarks for this conference, I thought about situations in the past few years where visiting lecturers, as I mentioned, were actually prevented from speaking. Protesters either shouted them down, commandeered the microphone, showed up in a large group and chanted ad nauseum or threw a bullhorn. What one sees in protests meant to disrupt, but not engage a visiting speaker, is plenty of conviction, but not much of an argument. They are, shall we say, mighty in numbers and moral indignation, but pitifully weak in logic or evidence. In a word, bullying replaces reason. What cannot be defended with words, no surprise, is imposed through intimidation, in some cases violence. Simply put, the disruption is the point. It's an expression of power, not an invitation to argue, reason, or debate. For those who see themselves as powerless, they exercise what little power they can muster. What's that power? Exploiting the civility of those who have gathered, not to speak primarily, but to listen. The disruptors take advantage of an event they did not plan, an audience they did not assemble, a venue they did not reserve, and a speaker they don't intend to listen to or otherwise engage in civil discourse. To give in to disruptive protests undermines the purpose of a university. It teaches students to avoid disagreements and opposing opinions. It teaches them that what matters in this world is might, not right. What matters is whether you can force people to shut up, at which point we will have abrogated our authority as an institution of higher learning. I can't help but think that the use of rhetoric that divides a people or a country into categorically oppressors or oppressed has actually facilitated the rise of these tactics of disruption. After all, if you already know who the good guys and bad guys are, there's no point in arguing. Simply do what you can to take control and dictate your terms. In case of a disruption, and I'll conclude with this, I would just try, if I was still allowed to use the microphone, if there was a disruption, I would ask the protester or the group, what are you looking for? I'll be more specific. Do you seek knowledge or power? If you seek power, you are in the wrong place. A university is a place to pursue knowledge. It is a community of learners where both student and professor are truth seekers. It's what they have in common. It's what makes them a community, this collective commitment to pursuing the truth wherever it lies. If it is power you seek, this is neither the time nor the place, and certainly not the manner with which to achieve it. That you will have to find elsewhere. Frederick Douglass never went to college, but his exercise and defense of free speech exemplifies what should be the aim of every American university. To fulfill their truth-seeking mission, they must cherish and therefore protect what he called the rights of the hearer, as well as those of the speaker. As a community of learners, this must be our common commitment. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Thank you. I will now evade your questions.
So we have a microphone on this side and on the other, and I'll let you call folks if anyone has a question. I can prime the pump
We got one.
real quickly. You got one? Let's go with students first.
You said something about like the intelligence of communicating starting from the home, with how like Frederick Douglass thought that that's where all the discussion starts and begin. Can you expound on that a little bit?
Sure. I made that connection to the homes. What we call civic education, we think that means teaching a push, right? AP US history. It means talking about what I had to do to get out of 7th, 8th grade. I watched Schoolhouse Rock. Some of you guys know what that is. And I memorized the preamble. Don't make me sing it, but I can. All I had to do was repeat, parrot back. I didn't have to understand the preamble. I just had to recite it, okay? That's what we typically think about civic education. What I was trying to point out is Douglass recognized, and at the time, the 1800s, education happened at the home. It began at the home. And for him, it was learning how to read. His legal master's wife, stupidly in the master's mind, started teaching Frederick Douglass, a slave, how to read. The master didn't know that was happening. And when he did, that was the quote I gave you. He's like, "You idiot, don't you realize treating him like a human being is the last thing that should happen to Douglass, because then he won't act like a chattel slave." So what I'm calling civic education, actually, I believe is rooted in the home. What it is that children, youth are learning from their parents about the world, and in this country, about the regime within which they live. So for Douglass, as soon as he realized that the legal master was no longer going to allow him to read, he recognized, what he doesn't want from me, I'm going after that, hammer and tong. And so he essentially, as his autobiography points out, he tricked kids in the neighborhood to teach him how to put letters together and words, and he would dare them, read that sign, no, that's not right. I was trying to make the connection between the literacy and education that happens in the home to what eventually became in his life, his vocation, which was teaching America how to live up to its principles.
Cool.
Checks in the mail.
Yeah, that's cool.
No right-wingers? All right, here we go, front row.
You spoke about that's loud. You spoke of AP US history and just reciting information. Do you think we've taken it from just reading information to now we need to go back to interpreting information, like the school and education systems have brought it in from this, bring it in, push it back out to now only the universities are at that point? Or do you think we need to start instilling the general thought, the discussions, the debates at the younger education levels as well?
I absolutely think we have to start earlier. What unfortunately has happened is we're still reeling from a pivot, at least in terms of standards at the state level. Most education is governed by state, not the federal government. We're still reeling from the pivot towards preparing kids for STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, medicine, that sort of stuff. So the real testing goes on in terms of things you can calculate and measure, math, right? In the Commonwealth of Virginia, I think it's junior year, you take a test to prove you understand Virginia history and the Constitution and those sorts of things. But we test it so infrequently that it is not rewarded. And that which is not rewarded is not done, or it's not done well. I, John, and many others, professors in this room, participate in high school and middle school teacher workshops, formally civic education. These teachers, the social studies teachers, science teachers, history teachers, they eat this stuff up. They love it. And they devote their summers when they should be at the beach or in the mountains or, floating down rivers or fishing or whatever. They devote their summers boning up on their discipline. They want to know what's the latest scholarship. But that's just because they have a heart for learning. But unfortunately, education, generally speaking, at the K through 12 level has not valued that kind of instruction. And therefore, they're not required to teach a whole lot of history at the middle school or high school level. And if they do, they got to do it like rapido speedo. In other words, they have to take a whole huge swath of world history, in fact, and try to get it done in a semester or two. So in short, I think we do, I hope we're returning to a point where we see the necessity of teaching people about, especially in this country. If you're growing up in this country, you should know about this country. What I call the long history of civil rights that didn't begin in the 1950s and 60s. It began even before 1776. Slaves before 1776. Adam might have made an allusion to this earlier. Slaves were petitioning for their freedom before the Declaration of Independence. What on earth possessed them to do that? Where did they get their rights? They got them from two places: the Bible, and they got it from what they were hearing, and a few of them reading in papers and pamphlets and books. In other words, the discussions that came to fruition in the Declaration of Independence, it was already in the air. You didn't have to be literate to understand the principles that all men are created equal. I mean, if you read these slave petitions, you'll see that they might as well be cribbing from Thomas Jefferson.
Hi. So
Who's talking? Where are you? There you are.
Hi. So on the topic of cancel culture and what we see on most college campuses nowadays with people speakers being just silenced so they can't even come speak, what exactly is the best way to combat that? Because you
Great
can't
question.
necessarily tell the students to stop expressing their opinion that the speaker shouldn't speak.
Right. That's why I said what has to happen is not just an instruction, but a modeling. The example that I think of that happened fairly recently was at, of all places, an elite law school, Stanford, where they had I believe it was a federal circuit judge invited to speak. It's a law school. You'd think at a law school they're training lawyers. Sorry, that's just about as simple. This is like kickball, slow baby bouncies. They are instructing students in how to be advocates for their client. The best advocate for his client or her client is someone who knows both sides of the issue, okay? And how do you know that you know your side well if you haven't tested it by opposing viewpoints? So you have a federal circuit court judge who a few students had read about or heard about, didn't like what they thought he was going to say, and so they came into the hall en masse and shouted so that he could not even begin his remarks. And worse, because of who did it, an associate dean or assistant dean, starts with an A, one of those deans you have, came up and took the side of the students and started reading the speaker the riot act. Is the juice worth the squeeze and all that kind of stuff. If you're interested in this case, you should read what the then, I think she was the provost now she's either the president of Harvard, she actually got a promotion. She wrote the most articulate defense of free speech that I have seen in the public sphere short of a book. The modeling should have been done by the administrator, is what I'm saying. The speaker should have been protected. And in fact, at the time, Stanford had regulations and the students were emailed ahead of time. This is how we comport ourselves. The students violated that, and it did not look like they were going to get punished. And so she wrote this, I think it was like an 8 to 10 page letter. It was so good. Mine's underlined. It's got emojis and lightning bolts and crazy stuff on it. What they are starting to do, and now they're actually having to explain to entering students, look, this is what we do here. This is what we're going to try to train you to do really well when you get out of here. And that means you're going to have to hear things you don't like. Let's equip you to know how to pay attention, follow an argument, and then decide whether you have the wherewithal to knock it down. So what I think universities need to be doing, like for example, I don't even know, my university, Washington University, I think it's a pretty good school. I've been there, it's my 26th year there. I don't know that freshman orientation, first year orientation, they talk at all about free speech, at all about this being a place safe from cancel culture. Your classroom should be a place where you are encouraged towards a civil but robust expression of diversity of views. I would recommend that to my university. This is something they should do. They should, if the kids don't come equipped with that way of thinking about what the purpose of education is, orientation would be a pretty good place to start. So it needs to be modeled, not just ink on paper. It needs to be modeled and enforced.
Excuse me, but I think you mentioned at one point how the Union were supporting slavery. Can you please elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Did you guys hear that question that I alluded or made reference to the fact that free states, you used union, but I think you mean that free states remaining in a union with slave states were actually aiding and abetting slaveholding. That was Frederick Douglass's view until about 1850. Okay, that's the Garrisonian school of abolitionism. The motto at the top of the Liberator newspaper, the premier abolitionist newspaper of the day, one of its slogans was "No union with slaveholding." Okay, how do the free states facilitate slavery? According to the Constitution, there is what's known as the Fugitive Slave Clause. The word slave is not used, but everybody, most people, shall we say, understand that that was a compromise with the slaveholding states in 1787. So what does this mean? Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1793, and then it was revised in an even more notorious way as part of the compromise measures of 1850. Fugitive Slave Act provided that if a slave fled from his state and crossed state lines into a state where it was against the Constitution or laws to hold a person in bondage, it required that that person, if they were apprehended by the master or a bounty hunter, say, that that person be returned to the original jurisdiction. So the free states, in the same way they would return a murderer who crossed state lines or a thief, they would, the fancy word we use today is extradite, right? In the same way you would extradite a fugitive from justice, slaves under the Constitution were required to be returned to their legal owners. And so what Garrisonian abolitionists, and Douglass was one of them until about 1850, they complained about the Constitution because free states were required to have blood on their hands by aiding the capture of escaped slaves. And in fact, it was a law that facilitated the kidnapping of free blacks. Okay? So that's just one way. They're also required under the Constitution to put down what was known at the time as domestic insurrections, which would include what they called servile insurrections. In other words, if there were a slave rebellion to take place in any state, and it was too big for that state to handle, the other states were obligated to help put that insurrection down. So those were, I think, the two most glaring ways that free states were required to help slave states extend the lease on slavery's life as an institution. Hope that was the question you were asking, because that's a pretty good answer.
Yeah, thank you.
We got one down here. What's it say on your sweatshirt?
You said that, I think Frederick Douglass had said that the U.S. can be fixed by what the U.S. has.
Yes.
And is that still true when people are underrepresented and when the U.S. is taking away laws from its own citizens, as well as taking away just basic necessities?
Okay, yeah, it's a pretty broad question. I'll approach it this way. I was citing Bill Clinton when he said there's nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America. That's what he said in his first inaugural address. And I was saying that mindset, or that approach to having, as it were, a critical appreciation of this country, not thinking everything is great, but we're also not the devil incarnate either, that there is enough good in America, both in its principles as well as its institutions, and those are the Constitution, our lawmaking bodies, et cetera, that we don't have to look to any other country, any other philosophy to figure out how to make this a more perfect union, if you will. We can look to our own, even our own slave-holding founders, and see in their writings, their practice, that's a separate conversation we'd have to have, but at least what they claim to be the ground or basis of their rights was something that was not an appeal to race or sex or ethnicity, nation of origin. It was the ground of humanity. And if we can return to that kind of rhetoric, in other words, the way we speak to each other as fellow citizens, I think that is the most secure way and just way for us to promote progress and reform in our politics. Now, you kept it general in terms of laws that were being removed, that were depriving people of certain things or basic necessities. I can't address that unless I know exactly you said something about the people who are underrepresented. If you want to elaborate on that.
Well, I mean, I just, like you said, that when they, what they were first saying, our founding fathers, didn't have a basis on race or anything, but in the American experiment class that I'm taking, we were told that basically these were the laws for people who had land and were white landowners. Mm-hmm. And so I feel let's
take that example.
Yeah.
It is true, and Lincoln actually pointed this out in 1857, one of his criticisms of the Dred Scott opinion. He said, good grief, you're going to tell me you're going to use the Dred Scott opinion, which said famously that blacks had no rights that the white man was bound to respect. Probably the most notorious thing ever said by a Supreme Court justice ever. Okay, Lincoln says, you're going to look at that and tell me that indicates what rights blacks had or didn't have at the founding, but don't you realize if it says anything, it says too much? In other words, the fact of the matter is most whites couldn't vote at the time of the founding. In other words, they were being very selective in their historical examples. So let's take that. Worst case scenario. Very few, in some states you had to swear that the Old and New Testament was the inspired word of God to hold office. That was in the Constitution of one of the states. Okay, so let's take the worst case example. You take the worst case example and then you say, well, what are the levers of progress? How are we going to promote justice? How can we make it truly equal protection of the law, not just a protection of the few that wrote the laws, right? And the way you do it is by looking at what they actually wrote in their Bills of Right, which a lot of times are at the front of the Constitution, not at the end, as in the federal Constitution. So if in Massachusetts, here's a great example, checks in the mail. 1780, Massachusetts they ratify a new constitution, right? 4 years after the Revolution, the war's almost over. 1781, Yorktown, all that, Treaty of Paris a few years later. So Massachusetts passes a new constitution. And in their Bill of Rights, the very first sentence, Civil War John's going to correct me here, but it says something to the effect that all men are born free and equal. That's right. Hey, wow. Not a misplaced comma. Slavery was legal in Massachusetts in 1780. So a woman named Mum Betts and then a man named Quack Walker. She takes on the name Elizabeth Freeman later. But Mum Betts in 1781 and Quack Walker a couple of years later, they sue not to abolish slavery. They sue for their own freedom according to the Bill of Rights, which no black person had a hand in writing. And you know what the judge said? Who wrote all? No, he didn't say that. He says, it says all there. And then he makes a reference to the Declaration of Independence. He says what everybody knew at the time, which was, we know that our own Constitution, as it were, was breathing the air of the Revolution. That for Massachusetts to have an institution that contradicted its Bill of Rights could not be abided by anymore. And so in a matter of a few years, the petitions of individual enslaved black people, a black woman and a black man, they used the words of white men to get those white men to do right by them. And that's what abolished slavery in Massachusetts. In 6 or 7 other states of the original 13, where was slavery? New Jersey, New York, a lot of slaves there. They would pass what are known as gradual manumission laws. In other words, according to the principles that weren't racist principles, they weren't a reflection of white supremacy. How they were implemented and applied, again, another conversation. But at least in principle, the good news was, these silly people, they wrote it down. They wrote it down. Right. You want to talk the Confederate Constitution, which actually uses the word Negro slavery? Sue for your rights there. There was a provision in the Confederate Constitution that said no law can be passed to ban slavery, according to the Confederate Constitution. Where's your lever of freedom there? Right? So I'm juxtaposing those to show you that one was the last one I mentioned, that's a clear case of systemic, what we call today systemic racism. It's in the Constitution. You can't find that in the U.S. Constitution. In fact, the first time, as I mentioned earlier, the first time that slave is actually recorded in the Constitution is when we decided to get rid of it, the 13th Amendment. Okay? So I can give you other examples of this, but the point being, one of the great advantages that we have as Americans is our own principles are the standard by which we judge our performance. And when our performance is lacking, when there is deprivation, truly unjust, true inequality before the law, we can at least point to the law and, most importantly, point to the Constitution to seek a correction. That's the general, the thrust of the argument I was making.
I have a question.
I'm not answering your questions.
Could you clarify, Frederick Douglass was a Garrisonian, and they had a very derogatory view of the Constitution.
Pro-slavery.
And yes, and later he says the Constitution's a glorious liberty document. So can you juxtapose those two views?
Sure,
Particularly,
sure.
I'm thinking of what's known as the fugitive slave provision, because you
Right,
brought it up earlier.
Right. Try to make this short. Under Garrison's mentorship and other abolitionists, Douglass held the view that all Southern slaveholders had of the Constitution. That even though it doesn't say slave, we all know. Even this is before Madison's notes are published in the 1840s. We all know slavery's in there. 3/5 compromise, fugitive slave clause, non-importation ban, domestic insurrections, right? Boom, 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 boom. Those are all concessions to a minority, a numerical minority of American states at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. So the abolitionists are like, well, where's the argument? Of course it's pro-slavery. It's helping states, and slavery was principally a state institution. It's helping states further entrench the institution of slavery. Therefore, it's an impure document. We shouldn't abide by a compact on the back of black men and women, right? Unconscionable, right? That was Douglass's view. He starts editing his own newspaper, the North Star, in December of 1847, like 6 months or so after he returned from the UK, and starts doing his own reading. Not that he didn't read before, but now that he's an editor, he feels more responsible about his public statements. He's like, okay, I'm like, it doesn't thrill Garrison that I'm starting my own paper competition, but he's like, I gotta come correct, or I shouldn't come at all. And so he starts doing his homework, and he reads especially this guy named Lysander Spooner. Modern day libertarians worship Lysander Spooner. But Lysander Spooner, William Goodell, patron of his, Garrett Smith, congressman for the Liberty Party. He starts reading these guys, and they start pointing out, especially after Madison's notes of the convention are published, he's like, oh, you know what? If slavery is so important, if it's so obvious that it's protected by the federal Constitution, isn't it weird that you have an institution that's supposed to be protected by the highest law of the land, and that institution is never mentioned? Bizarro. Preamble. It's the mission statement for the Constitution. Talks about the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Talks about justice. If slavery is so important, didn't it occur to them that they should mention it there? And so with some legal extrapolation, they're like, the onus shouldn't be on the pro-freedom people. This is a pro-freedom document. It leans towards freedom, which was what Douglas said in 1852. He says, you Southerners, you show me why this document protects a thing it never mentions. And so what has to happen, though, and this is where Douglas departs from Lincoln and the conventional Republican views, what has to happen is they have to start interpreting those compromises, which any decent person has to admit, these were compromises with the slave states. Even Douglas knows that. They have to start reinterpreting it according only to the text, not hidden or unwritten intentions, or we all know what they said. Because remember, and he points this out, Madison's notes were kept secret until his death. Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution, did not want his own notes, which are the most copious accounts of what was said in the debates. He didn't want them to have any role to play in the ratifying conventions of any of the states. He says the meaning of the Constitution is it's as if it came out of a black box. I don't care if it has Washington's signature on it or Hamilton's. Notice it has Hamilton, not New York, because he was one of three and the other two didn't sign it. He said, so this school of thought said we don't need to look at the convention, even though they borrowed from it where it was helpful. They said, all we should judge this by is what came out of that convention, because it had zero authority unless it was approved by Delaware all the way through, right? And so they said, we can only go by the text, and therefore it is fair for us to interpret texts that never mention slavery in a way consistent with the freedom-loving preamble. And so they started saying, where you think there's slavery, we think that applies to immigrants, it applies to indentured servants, these sorts of things. Push come to shove to force Douglas to admit, no, fugitive slave clause really does mean fugitive slaves. The argument he came up with is, well, given what we know from their writings that they didn't want slavery to last forever, we will treat it as a scaffolding for the country. And so that language was put in there in hopes that in a generation or so, and this was certainly Madison's view, in a generation or so, we will have outlived slavery's usefulness. And this is why we referred to it today in a phrase that they never used, a necessary evil. But that was the idea, that we couldn't get rid of slavery right away. We'll manage it and hope for a peaceful way to extricate ourselves out of this massively contradictory institution with regards to freedom.
Well, thank you for that. We are sadly out of time, but I'm sure the conversation will continue in the hallways. Please join us for 3 o'clock and thank our speaker, Dr. Lucas Morel.